Today, we typically only study the portion of the week. Today, what I'd like to study is, since we studied Pekude on Monday, this Wednesday, today, and also next week, I'd like to review a little bit about the Book of Esther, so that we can be prepared for the holiday of Purim, which is, God willing, coming up. So, hold on one second. Okay, so let us get started. Now, when we study the Book of Esther, there's so much to study. It's endless, limitless. I mean, this is the book that has mountains and mountains of insights. So what I really like to do is look at some of the Talmudic statements from the Book of Esther. And after we do that, then we can look at some of the Midrashim and some of the discussions. And I'm especially taken today by page in the tractate Megillah, which is discussion of the Book of Esther. There are hundreds of teachings from the Book of Esther in tractate about the Book of Esther in tractate Megillah. I'd like to see page Yud Gimel, Daf Yud Gimel, particularly really 13b. We'll start on the bottom of 13a of tractate Megillah to study the Book of Esther and to see how the rabbis associated the Book of Esther with lessons for our lives. So Esther is, of course, in some ways, the most relevant book for the Jews outside the land of Israel, but also in many ways, the Jews in the land of Israel have a very hard time relating with the Book of Esther, because they say, well, what do you mean the Jews are in trouble? Where's Sahal? Send Sahal in. What do you mean that they're trying to ingratiate themselves with the king? It's very hard for children in Israel to relate to the story of the Book of Esther. So we're going to start reading the commentary of the Talmud on the Book of Esther from Megillah 13b, the last line of 13a. And first, the Talmud is commenting on that it says that Esther did not tell her nationality. So this is a reference to a verse from the Book of Esther. Hold on. Let me just cite the verse here. Getting it exactly right. First, I have to find the book. No, I got it. Here we go. It says right here in chapter 2, verse 20, it says, Ein Esther magedet moladata v'atama. And Esther did not say her nationality. She refused to tell Achashverosh she was Jewish. Even though she was she was going to be selected as the queen, she did not say her nationality. Now, of course, there's always been a few people in public American life who say they didn't know they were Jewish. Madeleine Albright comes to mind. She says she was shocked she was Jewish. The president of Princeton claims he didn't know he was Jewish until a few years ago. Color me skeptical, but Esther also didn't tell anybody she was Jewish. Now, Mordechai had his own reasons for keeping it a secret, but we'll get into that. So the first, let's see what the Talmud says. I'm a Rebbe Elazar. So the Rebbe Elazar taught that Esther, why did Esther hide her secretness? Why did she hide her nationality? And the word Esther really means lastir, to cover over. So her whole identity is connected to this idea that she was covering over her Jewishness. So what do we do from the fact that the verse states in the book of Job that Elihu responds to Eov, lo yigra mitzadik einav, meaning to say that Hashem watches over the actions of the tzaddikim to pay them their reward measure for measure. And even if their immediate payment is delayed, in the end, they will receive their full reward. So it talks about certain special qualities of certain people. Bischar tzniut sh'hayta b'Rachel. Now Rachel had the quality of modesty. And as a result of this, Zachta v'yatza mimena Shaul. As a result of this, she merited, we're on 13b in Tractate Megillah, she merited that King Saul came from her. Mislar tzniut shahaya bo b'Shaul, Zachta v'yatza mimenu Esther. Then in the merit of Saul, Esther came, in the merit of the modesty of Saul. So, hold on one second. I have to tell my son. Okay. So we know that Esther, the Gemara is telling us that Esther is associated with the quality of modesty. Now, this is at first glance very strange, because what's so modest about being hiding your Jewishness and going with the non-Jewish king, with the king of Persia? So first of all, the Talmud asks, what was the modesty of Rachel? If you ask somebody about the quality of modesty, what would you associate it with? Usually today it's associated with certain ways in which people dress that, were associated with covering up lots of your body. That's usually what modesty is associated with. But the Talmud says something else. It says, as it states, Vayaged Yaakov l'Rachel ki achi aviyahu, that Jacob told Rachel that he is the brother of her father, and that's why he wants to marry her. V'chi achi aviyahu, is he the brother of her father? V'halo achot, avalo ben achot aviyahu. Jacob was the son of her father's sister. Ela amarla. So rather, Jacob said to Rachel, Minas patli. He said, will you agree to marry me? She said, yes. Rachel said, yes, I'll marry you. However, my father is a trickster. My father is going to not allow it. He's going to deceive you. So, v'lo yachlasle. And you're not going to be able to defeat him with his trickery. So Jacob said, don't worry, I could be his brother in deception. I know how to deceive also. I can also be his brother in deception. She said to him, is it permitted for a righteous man, for a tzaddik, to be deceptive? Jacob said, yes, it is, because we know in the book of Shmuel, he cites a verse that it says that David said to God, meaning to say, if there is a person who is acting with you deceptively, you can also act with deception in return. So Jacob said to her, what's he going to do? What are we worried about? So Rachel said, well, I have a sister, and she is older than me, and he's never going to allow me to get married before her. So therefore, what did Yaakov do? Yaakov gave her signs. Yaakov gave Rachel signs, and he said that under the chuppah, you're going to tell me these signs, and as a consequence, once you tell me these signs, I'll know it's really you and it's not Leah. By the way, let me pause for a moment and see if does anybody know what these signs are. I'll pause for a moment. What are the signs that Jacob gave to Rachel? The signs were the 3 mitzvos that are incumbent upon a woman to do. And these are the mitzvos of Nida, that a woman has to go to the mikvah. The Chala, the woman is supposed to separate a tithe of Chala. V'adlakas haner, and the woman is responsible for lighting candles. That's what the Bali Atoso says. There are some other explanations, but that's the main thing. So Kimat Alayla, that night, when it came the first night of the wedding, and it was supposed to be Rachel, instead Lavan substituted Leah. Rachel saw that he was putting Leah in, that Lavan was putting Leah in her place, and she said, my sister is going to be very embarrassed. Misartanu Niwa. So Rachel gave the signs to Leah. And that's what it says, Vayiba Boker Vihine Leah. When Jacob woke up in the morning, he discovered it was Leah. That means that until now, he did, because of the signs that Rachel gave to Leah, Jacob didn't realize that it was Leah. And so therefore, as a result of this, she gave birth to Saul, that Saul descended from her. And what was the modesty that came from Saul? How do we know that Saul was modest? Because Saul hid from his uncle the fact that he had been anointed to be the king. It says in the first book of Samuel that he said to him, "We found the donkeys," but that that after Samuel had anointed Saul, Saul did not tell anybody that he'd be anointed king. He told him, "We found the donkeys." But he didn't say, because Saul is the phrase, he went out looking for donkeys and he found the kingdom. So he didn't tell anybody that he'd be anointed king. And so therefore he merited that Esther came out from him as a result of her modesty. The Talmud doesn't say exactly what was the modesty of Esther. So let me just say, the Talmud says because Rachel was modest, and what was her modesty? That she allowed her sister to get married to Jacob by telling her the signs. Therefore, it resulted in the modesty. A modest man came from her. And who was that? That modest man was Saul. And because Saul didn't tell anybody they'd be anointed king, because they had to keep it a secret for them. Then after Saul came Esther. And what was the Talmud doesn't tell us why Esther specifically came from Saul, but we know that Saul comes from Esther because it says about Saul. We know that Esther comes from Saul because it says Ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish, that Mordechai comes from Kish, and Mordechai was the uncle of Esther, and Shaul is also the son of Kish. So therefore, we know that it's from the same line. But it doesn't say where was Esther modest. So the Bach, Rabbi Yoel Circus, writes that his version of the Talmud states, what was Esther's modesty? Because she didn't share her birth. And so that was the primary reason. So we see from here, what was the modesty of Esther? The primary modesty is that she kept her mouth quiet, that she didn't babble, that she didn't share secrets. We see from here that the most modest way to act is, even though Rachel's modesty was that she revealed the secret to Leah, but that was to prevent her from being embarrassed. But the most modest way to act is to be quiet and not to share things that are not supposed to be shared. That's the definition, really, we see from this story of modesty. And that's incredibly important. Loose lips sink ships. And another explanation of why Esther was considered modest was because in chapter 2, when they were looking for a queen, it said in chapter 2, verse 15 of the book of Esther, chapter 2, verse 15, it says, Ubagia Torah Esther. And when it came time for Esther to go before the king, that all the other women were requesting different ways to make themselves beautiful. She requested nothing. She did not request jewelry. And so these two things are definitions of her modesty. One, that she covered herself, i.e., she did not ask for anything, and also that she did not reveal her secretness, her secret. So the Marsha, writing in the 15th century, asked, I don't understand. The reason why she didn't share her identity was not because she was so modest, was because the verse states that Mordechai, it says in chapter 2, verse 20, like we just read, that Mordechai told her not to share her modesty. Kasher tziva aleha Mordechai. Mordechai told her. So she didn't do it because she was modest. She just did it because she was listening to Mordechai. And so the answer he gives, is that at first, before she got married to Achashverosh, there Mordechai commanded her not to say anything because he didn't want her to marry the king, because then he would think she comes from the great lineage of David of Shaul, and also from David, because Mordechai was from Ish Yehudi. But afterwards, he commanded her, when he had already selected her, and there was no concern that he's marrying her for her lineage, he commanded her also not to tell. And so that's his explanation. But anyway, we see from here, to me, the powerful idea here is that a lot of people talk about modesty. How are we modest? We see from here that the most important way to be modest is to be discreet and to not share things that aren't supposed to be shared, to not talk about things that aren't supposed to be talked about, and to just keep things to yourself. And before you share something, it's not saying never share something, because Rachel had to share with Leah, but before you share something, we have to think very carefully, what is the benefit of this, and is it appropriate? And that was how the redemption came about. And this story was because Esther was discreet in the beginning. So now we're up to the next teaching from the tractate. It says, as follows. It says in the book of Esther, this verse that we were just commenting on, it says, Esther did not tell us her. Ain't Esther Magenet Moladatav etama. She didn't tell us her nationality, or I don't know if you could say nationality. We don't really have nationalities back then. She didn't say where she was born, the etama, and her people. Kasher tziva Allah Mordechai, like Mordechai commanded. The Ma'amar Mordechai Esther Oseh, and the word of Mordechai Esther did. And so now that begs the question: what was this word of Mordechai that Esther commanded? What was this word of Mordechai that Esther commanded? So the Talmud says, in the teaching of Rabbi Yirmiyah, Shaita Mara Dam Nida L'Chachamim, that Esther, even when she was in the house of Achashverosh, would show the blood of her menstrual blood to the sages to see if it was actually menstrual blood or if it was not menstrual blood, in which case she would not be considered what's called a nida. So she showed it to the sages. And why is the Talmud telling us this? So the first reason is it's to indicate that even though Esther was living in the home of Achashverosh, she was very careful, very, very careful to observe all of the laws of the Torah. And so even about the laws of Nida, she would show that to the Chachamim. How was she able to be with Achashverosh during this difficult time? Hold on. So how was she able to be with Achashverosh? So the Zohar, or actually the Zohar discusses this, but some of the commentaries explain that, and this is I'm sure some people are going to find this shocking, that there was actually, she was never with Achashverosh, but it was done with a demon, that her body transformed into a demon. This is how the rabbis want to try to explain away Esther being forced to be with Achashverosh by saying that it really wasn't her. I mean, that's a deviation from the text, but it just shows you the strength of the rabbinic belief in Esther's purity and piety, even while she's in the palace of Achashverosh. To my mind, the story is much more complicated than that, because it shows Esther is struggling. I mean, if we just take the story the way it literally says, it shows Esther struggling with her faith while trying to accomplish an incredibly important task of saving the Jewish people. And to me, it's being in Washington and seeing people have those struggles all the time. That rings true. But the Talmud takes the idea that Esther was, at least most of the commentaries in the Talmud, most of the teachings in the Talmud take the idea that Esther was pure the whole time. So we'll look at the next line. The next verse tells us that Mamar Mordechai Esther Oseh, and the words of Mordechai Esther would do. This is chapter 2, verse 20. Kasher Haita be'amnaito, just as like when she was raised by him. So amna means, this word amna means an expression of being raised. That she did the word of Mordechai just like when he raised her. So Amarabba bar Lema, what does this mean? Shaita omedes. Okay, this is what I was referring to. That what's going on here? This is going to be very complicated. So everybody has to be very careful how we quote this, how we study this, how we understand this. But I'll first read it, and then we could go into it in depth. So what does it mean? It means, what does it mean, ba'amna ito? Says the verse, says Rabbi Bar Lema in the name, he says, Shahaita omedes micheko shel Achashverosh. She would get up from the bosom of Achashverosh, v'tovelet, and immediately after getting up from the bosom of Achashverosh, she would immerse in the mikvah, so she wouldn't be disgusting when she went to Mordechai, the righteous one, after sleeping with Achashverosh, v'yoshevet b'cheiko shel Mordechai, and then she would go and dwell in the bosom of Mordechai. So it makes it sound like Esther was going from the bedroom of Achashverosh straight to the bedroom of Mordechai. And this is just an incredibly hard concept to accept, because Esther is one of the 7 female Nevi'im, one of the 7 female prophets, as actually this text tells us. How can we understand this? And also, it's one thing if she's forced to be with Achashverosh, but then she goes back to Mordechai. So Tosfos has a problem with this. Tosfos gives us an answer. Tosfos' answer is the Tovelos v'Yosheves b'cheiko shel Mordechai. Tosfos says, but wait, how can you do that? There's another problem. You're not allowed to, if you're with another man before you go to one's husband, you have to wait 3 months because you want to make sure that she's not pregnant. So how could she go straight from Achashverosh to Mordechai? So the Tosfos says that she used Haita mishameshet b'moch. She used a moch. Moch is a contraceptive that she used a contraceptive, and so therefore she didn't have to worry about being pregnant because there was a contraceptive. Others say, some of the rabbis say that maybe the one who was with Achashverosh was the moch, meaning the name of the demon who substituted for Esther. That's a big jump from the literal text of the Talmud, but his name was Moch. So okay. Anyway, this is obviously a very difficult idea, these concepts. So I'm just sharing what the text of the Talmud is here. And they're obviously wrestling with this difficulty of Esther being in 2 worlds, going from one world to the other. It's really hard for us to appreciate it because we know that Esther is completely righteous. And it's one thing if she was going to be with Achashverosh, but then why would she return to her husband and on a daily basis? So it's incredibly complicated, but I'm just sharing it with you. Moving right along, now we come up to the next verse, chapter 2, verse 21. And what does the Talmud say about that? By Yamim in those days, Mordechai Yoshev b'Shar Melech, Mordechai was sitting at the gates of the king. Katzaf b'Ktam Vateresh Shnei Sarisei HaMelech Shomrei Asaf. So Bigsan and Seresh, who were two of the servants of the king, Sarisei, or the chamber servants of the king, from the guardians of the threshold, they became enraged. And they sought to kill Achashverosh. So it doesn't say why they became enraged. Doesn't say why they became enraged, but they became enraged, and Mordechai heard about it. It says in the verses, like, the matter became known to Mordechai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told it to the king in the name of Mordechai. And then they ended up killing Bigsan and Seresh. So let's see what the verse says here. So let's see what the Talmud says. In those days, Mordechai Yoshe B'Shar Melech, Mordechai is sitting at the gate of the king, and Bigsan and Seresh became enraged. So why does it say? Why does it need to say they became enraged? Why doesn't it just say they intended to kill Achashverosh? Why does it have to tell us they were upset? Obviously, they wanted to kill him. Who cares why they were trying to kill him, whether they were enraged or because maybe they were just ambitious? Why does it have to say they became enraged? So says Rabbi Chiya bar Abba in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Hiktzif HaKadosh Baruch Hu Adon Alav Adav, that Hashem, it's telling us that we have to compare this to a similar story, where a similar political story, where there was a political event that happened years before, and it helped the Jews achieve success. And that was the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph, that Hashem caused Pharaoh to get upset at his servant in order, so to son tzaddik, umanu Yosef. As it says, Shenemar itanu nar ivri. So God caused Pharaoh to get upset at his servants in order for Joseph to be in the position to help them, and then later, or to be with them, and then later on for Joseph to ascend as a result of that. And so too, at the same time, Avadim Adoneim, God arranged here for servants to be upset at their master, so Nesla Tzaddik, to do a miracle for the Tzaddik, and that's Mordechai. It says Vayivada Davar Mordechai. So the basic point was that God is arranging the story years in advance. We live in a world where everybody is getting the news instantly, and we always do instant analysis. Is this good for the Jews? Is this bad for the Jews? Is this guy good or bad? But the Talmud is saying that the whole story is being arranged by God, and we sometimes only will discover it years later. We suddenly see Hashem's plan years later. Do you know how long the Purim story takes place over? How many years does the Purim story take place over? Does anybody know? Anybody know? Anybody know how long the Purim story takes place over? Let me just pause if you don't want to answer on this. So now we go on to these two figures who tried to overthrow Achashverosh. Says Rabbi Yochanan, Bigtan and Teresh, Shnei Tarsiim Havu. Bigtan and Teresh were two people who came from Torsi. Ayumusaprim Belashon Torsi. And they were speaking in this language called Torsi, because they knew that there were no Torsim around them. And they said, we don't have to speak secretly because nobody else knows Torsi here. And now, by the way, this is a very big idea in this book, is the importance of language. At the very beginning of the book, one of the decrees of Achashverosh that was that you have to speak in the language of the man in the household, not in the language of the woman. It's a very important point that Achashverosh made. And some people are like, why is that there? Because you see that the language is so important to control the situation. Hold on, let's see. Right, so that happened in the 12th year, right? So the chapter 3, verse 7 states that it took place in the 12th year of the reign. So it took place over 9 years, but then that's when Haman threw the lots. So therefore, since that's when he threw the lots, And then the victory happened that year. So the story takes place over 9 years, basically, a little bit longer, because afterwards Esther and Mordechai solidified their power. So we see from here that I think the rabbis were saying the importance of knowing the language is having access to power when you know the language. So they spoke in the language of Torsi, and they say Miyom Shabbat Zo Lo Ra'inu Shena Be'inenu. They said from the day that Esther, what were they saying? From the day that Esther came, what was their complaint? From the day that Esther came here, we haven't got any time to sleep because he was making parties all the time and making us bring wine all the time. So what was their complaint? Their complaint was we're working too hard. Which is, by the way, of all the reasons to overthrow the government, the reason is he's making me work too hard. I don't have enough vacation. Seems a little schwach, a little weak of a reason to overthrow the government. So he says, let's put some poison in his cup so that he dies. And they didn't think Mordechai would hear. How did Mordechai know Torsian? Says the Talmud, because Mordechai was a member of the Sanhedrin. And in order to be a member of the high court of the Jewish people, you had to know all the 70 languages. This is another, like a subtle teaching of the rabbis that in order to achieve knowledge and strength amongst the nations of the world, you just have to be immersed in Torah, because all the answers are in the Torah. And but also in order to be in the high court of the Jewish people, you have to know all the languages. So you have to know all the 70 languages, not just Yiddish, not just Hebrew, not just English. You have to know all the languages. So even Kiryanda, you have to know Kiryanda. That's what they speak in Rwanda. You have to know everything. So they didn't know that. So he said, so one of them said to the other, how are we going to do it together? You're in charge of one task and I'm in charge of another. How can we do this together? He said, I'll do my watch one day and your watch, and then we'll be able to put in the poison. And that's why it states, and they hung both of them. Mordechai told Achashverosh, look for them in their tasks that day, and you won't find them, and that'll be the secret. Okay, so now we go up to the next part. The next verse states in chapter 3, verse 5, that when Haman got upset that Mordechai wouldn't bow down, he didn't want to just punish Mordechai by himself, because they told him that Mordechai was from the Jewish people. So Haman wanted to kill all the Jews. So why does it say? So the Talmud is bothered. Why does it say the people of Mordechai? He wanted to also punish the people of Mordechai. Why doesn't it say he wanted to punish the Jews? Why is it called Am Mordechai? So the Talmud tells us how the hatred of Haman grew. At first, Haman wanted to just kill Mordechai, and then he wanted to also kill the people of Mordechai, and then he also wanted to kill all the rabbis. When it says Mordechai, then it says the people of Mordechai, that means all the rabbis, and in the end, all the Jews. Vayivakesh Haman Shmid et Kol HaYehudim. So the hatred and the punishments grew, and this is like Pharaoh. Pharaoh first wanted to just kill the Jewish boys, and then he decided to kill all the boys, even the Egyptian boys. And the hatred, once hatred is allowed to exist, it will spread. It will spread. And we'll do one more teaching from the Talmud. It says as follows. It says as follows. We started with the idea of immodesty, and that concept of modesty is to be silent, to not share things. But now we look at what Haman says to Achashverosh, what was it that bothered him about the Jewish people? In chapter 3, verse 8, Haman said to the king Achashverosh, Yeshno Am Echad, there's one nation. So says Rava, what's the definition of Haman? What is so bad about him? Leika diyada lishna bisha kahaman. There's nobody who knows how to speak badly about people like Haman. That Haman knew how to talk badly in a manner to hurt the Jewish people. That Haman said to Achashverosh, let's kill them. So Achashverosh said, I'm afraid from their God, because I don't want their God to do to me like he did to my predecessors. So Haman said, don't worry about it. Yashnu mina mitzvos. The Jewish people, don't worry about it. They're not doing their commandments. They lost the protection of their God. Meaning to say they're only doing it in a rote manner. What was his complaint? His proof was they're just committing they're doing the commandments without fervor, without zealousness. So Achashverosh said, no, what about the rabbis? The rabbis are the rabbis are doing it with a lot of intention. The rabbis wake up early, they study the Talmud every day. You can't say the Jews are just going through the motions. Look about all the people in the yeshiva. So he says, no, they're one nation. If some of them aren't doing it, all of them are going to be punished. So then Haman says to Achashverosh, are you worried that when I do this, I'm going to destroy your kingdom? Don't worry about it. There is no amachan mefuzar mefurad. They're spread out. They're spread out. And you're not going to notice, the Jews are spread out, so you're not going to notice when we hurt them. And maybe you'll say that they benefit the Jews, mefurad, meaning to say the Jews are like a mule, like the word preda. They don't produce anything. Unless you'll say, there's one whole country that's filled with the Jews. No, they're all over the place, meaning to say they won't give you any problems. It's not like you're destroying an entire country. And their laws are different from everybody else. Now we get to really what Haman didn't like. They don't eat with us, and they don't marry our wives, and we can't marry them. And the laws of the king, they don't do. So what do? This is what he said, that every year the Jews don't work. Why? That they don't work on Shabbos and Pesach and on all the holidays. And they go through all the holidays that it can't work. And it's not worth it for the king to keep them because we eat and drink. But let's say there will be one fly that will fall into their cups, they will throw it out and continue to drink. But if a king touches their cup, then they throw it on the ground. And this is one of the whole purposes of the book, is to show that Achashverosh is so focused on drinking, but the Jewish people have different laws as it relates to wine, that if an idolater touches the wine of the Jews are not allowed to drink it or get benefit from it. And so we see that was one of the complaints that Haman makes to Achashverosh. Okay, we just started here our discussion of this very powerful book, but I wanted to stop now and see if anybody has any questions before we stop.